I'm very pleased to introduce Hayes Slade and James Slade. Tonight we are kicking it off with people who are doing a VC, Visiting Critics Studio, so it's really nice to have that. Could be a good way to start. James and Hayes started Slade Architecture in 2002, and they have a series of an extensive portfolio of commercial, residential, and cultural projects, as well as a wonderful portfolio of furniture pieces. The work is refreshingly playful and witty. It includes a range that I find remarkable, from projects like the Shanghai Barbie flagship, which has an ingenious play of sort of scale and image, and then other projects which are very sort of calm and very well, beautifully detailed gallery and loft projects. They've received numerous awards, including multiple AIA awards, multiple Store of the Year awards. They were a MoMA PS1 finalists. They won a PA award for the Doggy theme park, an award for design excellence in public architecture by the New York City Public Design Commission. They're also selected for the Ordos project. And finally, Slade Architecture was one of the Architectural Leagues of New York's 2010 Emerging Voices, and that's just a small grouping of their various awards. Their work has been published and exhibited widely. It's been published in multiple design books. There are so many that it's almost hard to read. Their Architectural Record, Architecture, Metropolis, Frame, Surface, Interior Design Magazine, and many, many other places. Their work has also been exhibited in the Venice Biennale, the National Building Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, the German Architecture Museum, and many other galleries internationally and in the country, as well as and as far as downstairs right here in the Architecture School in Syracuse, New York, which we'll see very soon. Exactly, that's the best for last. They've also held teaching positions at Pratt, Parsons, Florida, and Columbia University, and we're very happy to have them teaching here this spring. I'm pleased to introduce James and Hayes Slade.
Is this on? I don't think it really matters if it is or not. Well, thank you very much for coming out. We're delighted to have the opportunity to speak here, and thanks so much for the invitation for the speaking engagement, as well as the visiting critic spot. It's really exciting for us. So in our lecture tonight, context, concept, construct, our thought was to present some of our work as well as our process as much as we can, although it's very far from codified. It's really just a unique approach to every project. We find incredible inspiration in the context of each of our projects. That is to say, we approach each project with fresh eyes and consider the context in the most broad sense, including, the budget, the client, the program, the requirements, local codes, any international requirements that we might be facing. So in the setting of all this, you might think that everything were to come out kind of like these disparate pieces, these one-offs, but what we find is really uniting it is this consistent interest that we have in architectural concerns that run throughout all of our work, which would be things like the presence of the body in space and how our projects are interfacing with that, and perspective, the location of the visitor with the site and the scene that we're creating, and then lastly, materiality and how that impacts our choices and decisions. And we try to take all of that each and every time we're given a new challenge and come up with something that offers something new and innovation, and then something that goes beyond what we were charged with. Installation, a tiny installation that we did for floor interface. They make the carpet tiles that we're all probably very familiar with. One of the things we thought was interesting is that flor means flower in Spanish. We thought that was kind of a fun jumping off point. The other thing that we thought was particularly interesting is that carpet tiles are often used just because they create this replaceable field, which is incredibly convenient, but we kind of wanted to celebrate the individual character of them, sort of like their tileness. And we thought that an interesting way to do that would be to work in a radial pattern, because obviously that focuses on each individual piece. So within the setting that we were given, that odd L shape, we realized immediately that we'd have to do something to capture space beyond what we were given because it was kind of a disappointing footprint. So we immediately moved to kind of mirroring and working with the radial pattern that we came up with to create virtual spaces. And so by mirroring all the walls and bringing the pattern from the floor and creating a landscape surface, we were able to capture, virtually, miles and miles. And you can see that it created kind of a lounge space which sort of straddled the gray area between furniture and landscape. Funny picture. This next project was never built, and it was a proposal that we had for the largest tower. It would have been the largest tower in the world. And it was a radio tower that was to replace the radio antennas that were lost in the World Trade Center. We were actually brought in by an engineer that was approached by a developer, so it was an interesting relationship, and immediately became apparent when you're building at that scale that engineering and structural concerns are really driving what needs to happen. We found it a sort of an interesting challenge to create a geometry that would be pure and behave in a very pure and efficient fashion, but offer something unusual, and we came up with a sort of like a tripod structure that was repeating vertically and then stacked. And it was a very simple move, but the thing that we found so enticing about it was that as you would move in front of it or approach it by car or whatever, from different vantage points, it would look, it would look sometimes, like a very regular symmetrical tower, and then other times, as you can see in some of the middle images, it looks almost unstable, like it's falling over, and we found this very interesting, and especially appropriate because it was proposed for a site by the Liberty Science Center, which obviously has a charge to educate children on structures and forces. We thought that'd be an interesting relationship. This was a fly-through, but it doesn't seem like it's going to work. So how do I, okay, so this is a view at night, and another interesting just side factoid about this is this was actually a view from our old apartment, so it would have been great if it had gone to construction because we could have, just watched it daily. Now going from our very tallest ever project to our very smallest ever project, we were invited by the Design Trust for Public Spaces, which is a charitable organization in New York City, to create and donate a piece for their charity auction. They invited a number of artists and architects, and the theme for that year was Nest. It was sort of in the midst of all the foreclosures. And we immediately thought that we wanted to make a doghouse. One of the other sort of factors that figured into our decision was that we were going to be fabricating and donating the whole thing. So we wanted to keep it small, and we wanted to keep the materials practical. So the dog is supposed to jump in the pup tent. Seeing as we were donating the piece, we immediately began to think about the materials and how we might create something with a very quotidian kind of mundane material. So we immediately moved to plywood and thought of all the different ways that we could work with plywood. And we were fascinated by the way the very planar shape of the plywood would intersect with the form like a cone. So we experimented with a number of different approaches, and then we came up with this idea of really enforcing a very, very strict economy and building the whole thing out of a single sheet of plywood, so we came up with this sort of repeating wishbone pattern, which you see here, which is the actual pieces that we laid out on the sheet, had them cut, laminated them together, and then to really kind of reinforce the way you see the striations moving around the cone, we had it sanded smooth. And the effect was very interesting and very satisfying, especially considering its kind of, mundane origin. And it's a sustainable structure. It has natural daylight and a puppy stack effect. We did bring it outside and photograph it on the street in front of our office.
By the way, that is downstairs in the exhibit, one of those pup tents. So the next project that we're going to talk about is Ordos 100. Herzog and Demeron and Ai Weiwei and his company, Fake Design, invited 100 architects from around the world to design one villa in Inner Mongolia. This is the new city of Ordos, and the site is sort of just outside of the city. It's sort of a luxury housing on the river/reservoir there. there's very little existing context. It was just really a desert. So in that sense, it was a very difficult challenge for us because we do rely so much on the context. And here the context is sort of an unknown. It's a promise. But there was a master plan that faked Ai Weiwei did. It created a series of sort of primary streets and secondary streets, and then allocated a series of blocks, either 2 or 3 story blocks, depending on the lot size, all 10,000 square feet, which is pretty big. The thing that we found most compelling about the master plan is that in addition to the streets, it created a series of paths around each house, so you could literally walk around all 4 sides of every lot. So the intention here was very clear to create this sort of grouping of architectural objects, sort of residential development as exhibit in a way. And so we thought that was a very compelling and unusual context in which to build a house, particularly since this is our house. Particularly since often, housing is about creating a private sanctuary and not about being sort of on display. So we accepted all of the contextual constraints that we were given. We took the given volume, created a sort of sunken courtyard in the middle, pushing the ground floor down into the ground, and then cutting the landscape to provide access and direct sort of continuation of the ground plane into the space. We then also cut the top layer of the building to create views and allow sun into the courtyard. So that's sort of what generated the massing. The structure of each of the floors then had quite a different character because the top, because it had been separated, created sort of 3 pavilions with green space between them. In the middle was the courtyard, which is very traditional Japanese type, and we used that for the sort of the main living space. And then on the ground floor, which had been sunk and sort of exposed to the ground plane, you created more of a modernist, building as an extension of the landscape. And we thought it was interesting how you could create these kind of 3 types stacked on top of each other. The other thing that we thought was important is to be able to sort of deal with this need for privacy in a residential space, as well as acknowledge the fact that this is really kind of a showy sort of architectural object that is going to be viewed sort of in the round. And so we looked at the strategies for landscape in the 3 zones, and the public spaces, the sort of views that are open out to the public are the ones that are sort of buried into the ground a little bit, so that the mass of the house is pretty private in terms of the views from the street. Because we are always interested in this idea of view and perception and how the object is understood as you move through space, and typically we try and create a sort of dynamic changing condition that has to do with scale and point of view as well. So in this case, the shape of the building sort of is sort of parallelograms. None of the elevations on any side are even. And so from different points of view, perspectively, it takes on very different massing or dimensional quality to it. So a plane might look planar in one view and volumetric in another. It may take on a completely different shape from another view. And this was sort of dealing with this idea of an object viewed in the round, acknowledging that component of it. So this is sort of what you see as you walk around the house. Now, the other thing that was sort of given a constraint, Ai Weiwei suggested that we use brick. It's the most abundantly available, inexpensive material in the area. And what we thought was particularly compelling about brick in the context of China is that labor is so inexpensive there. So what we did, pardon? Yeah. So the strategy is very simple. We took the brick and allowed it to take the geometry of the massing that we'd already established, so that at each point, a course of brick lines up with a corresponding cut in the elevation. And then you just simply stack that, and because the conditions are different on every side, you end up getting multiple conditions on each face of the building through a very simple sort of device. This is the elevation. We also obviously created some openings, some more sort of diaphanous zones in the brick pattern by opening it up a little bit to let light in. But the overall strategy is a very simple strategy that just takes the geometry from it, from the building, and then carries it through, creating a series of different patterns on every elevation in a sort of very mechanical, dumb way. But it leads to tremendous variety. And then the other thing that we like about that is that these patterns take on very different qualities as the sun tracks the sky. So you have this kind of temporal change in the facade throughout the day. This is sort of the main street view. It's the most private in a way. There's just a little bit of an acknowledgement of an interior volume on the ground floor. This is one of the spaces that goes down into the public space in the recess there. That's Ai Weiwei coming out. He likes our house. And this is the view from the street. So you can see it is quite private. It is kind of this sculptural object. In addition, because of the conditions, well, globally, but also in China, we wanted to take advantage of this kind of massing we have and the open space in the middle to really allow the center of the house to sort of organize itself around that courtyard as a kind of landscape. And then we also took advantage of these kind of window boxes where we planted plants between the brick screen and the interior so that in the summer they would block the light and in the winter they would allow light in passively. Part of the program was also a swimming pool, and so we included that on the terrace level and took advantage of that so that again, it increases the stack effect. It has a natural tendency to cool the air that's coming in, and then we have stacks at the tops of the taller volumes to let the air out. This is just a view of the changing quality of the facade throughout the day. Our next project is also a residential project, a little closer to home. This is in Pennsylvania, near the Delaware River. It's a really beautiful 60-acre piece of land that sits sort of on a ravine adjacent to, it's a sort of a field that sits adjacent to a ravine, which is very densely wooded. So we chose the location right at the edge of that, at that boundary condition between the field condition and the much more densely wooded ravine. We thought that was the place that had sort of the most variety in experience. It was the most varied experience. So the house is organized so that it faces each of those four conditions, so that in any particular location within the house, you have a very different kind of context outside as you look out. So it's really about the views out. And given that starting point, then we looked at several ways of massing the building to sort of develop or exploit that kind of condition that we decided to develop. And we also looked at sun studies as well. So the final massing was very simple, kind of double bar. The main housing bar follows the ravine and the wooded lot. Because the site is very, we wanted to really emphasize the quality of the site. And so one of the things that we did is we started sort of carving out some parts of the site. We wanted to reuse the existing stone that's very common to the area. So we kind of created a stone base, partially dug into the site and partially built up from the site. And then that wall gets extended to connect to a series of existing stone walls on the site. And then the housing bar is really a kind of simple light frame structure that sits on top of that base. The plan is very simple. The garage is on the left, and then you have a couple of bedrooms on the two ends of the house, and the main central section is the living area. The house sort of floats on top of that stone plinth so that the landscape kind of cascades beneath it. And the house also, because it's tucked away, it sort of has a minimal sort of visual presence in the site, but you have these very dramatic views from each end of the house.
This next project is in downtown Manhattan, and it was for the public spaces of a condominium building. And it has an interesting relationship with the previous project in that, whereas the previous project was kind of focusing your view out, in this we were really working very hard to kind of bring the street and the activity in. We felt that people are really moving to that neighborhood just for that neighborhood. And so we wanted to have this particular, especially the public areas, feel more like, almost like a club or like part of the street scene to the extent that we could. And the other thing that we felt was very important was to bring natural light into the amenity space. They had proposed an amenity space below grade. And the first thing we did on the project was to request to move it up so that it was aligning with the windows. You can see there's the open space, which they very graciously agreed to. Through the use of materials, we kind of visually bring the sidewalk streetscape in and create another threshold, which is sort of pushed back. If you can see at the uppermost part of the plan there, that's where the concierge would be. And the idea was to we used a recycled glass terrazzo, which kind of looks like the sidewalk. You might need to squint a little bit, but that's okay. And the concierge part and the mailboxes and everything would be in the back, and that would kind of feel like the part where residents would go beyond. But if you were sitting in the lobby or something, it could feel something like, you know, what you would expect in a downtown Manhattan kind of scene. All the materials here, especially the materials from that very solid back wall, have a kind of ambiguous quality, and they're a mixture of aluminum and satin mirrored, back mirrored satin etched glass, all kind of working together to create this strong threshold which goes from the ground floor down into the lower amenity space, creating this type of configuration. That wall that was just highlighted was also mirrored, which pulls the light from the side, as you can see in this image, and doubles the space visually. Now this is the view from the upstairs looking down, and you can, you know, look directly into the kind of rec room that they have, which is really just for residents. And the idea here was that in the daytime, when the light's coming in, you're obviously getting natural light down in this area, and people can see down and kind of understand what's happening in there. This is another view from, now we're standing in the downstairs looking up. And then at night, kind of the activity that's down is almost advertising itself onto the street through the use of this back mirrored wall. But the wall is not, it's not a specular mirror, it's a diffuse reflection. So you're not actually seeing, you know, people and what's going on, but more just this sense of activity, which we felt would kind of create sort of an intrigue from the street level. And this is the view standing back and looking across, obviously.
So this next project is a commercial project, and again, the street life of New York was very important here. It was an important part of the context. The client was Flight Club. If you Google them, they come up as sort of one of the top 10 cool sneaker stores in the world. They had, their original store was a kind of very small storefront on Green Street. It was, you kind of had to know about them to know where they were. It was not a big street, Green Street, just off of NYU. And what they were trying to do is create a new flagship store, but they didn't want to lose that kind of underground, cool vibe. So they were very concerned about creating a large store on Broadway and sort of losing what their original kind of qualities. So what we thought was really nice about the space is that it was a really beautiful open space right on Broadway. And what we did is we kind of ripped as much of the facade as we could out and created just a very large doorway so that you literally feel like the space is an extension of the street. And the doors are these big pivoting doors. The handle is just basketball leather and rubber, which obviously recalls the basketball, which is an important component in sort of their iconography. We basically left the space very clean. We did include a basketball backboard in the back, which also works as a projector, so that you can project movies onto it during the day. And they do actually use it after hours to play basketball, which was kind of refreshing. I still haven't played there, but I'm always afraid I'm going to like trash some sneakers, which they have. But the strategy for the space was really, because we wanted to maintain this kind of authenticity and kind of street culture, we didn't want to create a space that was overly designed. So what we did is we left it as a raw space, and the kind of analogy that we use for how we would colonize a space is something akin to the way that the street is appropriated for, you know, basketball games, stickball, all these skateboarding, all these sports that kind of interact with the existing urban context and sort of riff off of it without changing it. So we really left it pretty blank. Plywood floors are new, but the main thing we used was the materials as sort of the architectural element. And you know, obviously baseball hats and sneakers, very colorful. We thought we'd just plaster the wall and just create a field of product, basically. The other thing that we did was we did incorporate, you know, rubber and basketball leather throughout all of the sort of touch points. So you have this kind of familiar material. One of the things that we like best about the store is the way that it gets occupied. Because we left it as a big open store, usually stores have fixtures in the middle. It feels a little bit like a basketball court, like after the game when the press is on there, or maybe even during a game if you're playing someone on the street. It gets very crowded, and it's really nice to watch people moving through the space. The sort of necessary kind of elements, like a mirror for your shoes and all that, gets incorporated in a kind of almost secondary way so that you don't really notice it until you need it. All of the materials are very simple: leather, rubber, plywood. So they were very happy with the store, and they asked us to go back to their original store, which is this very small storefront on Green Street, and create a place where they could sell used clothing and sneakers, sort of like 80s, 90s kind of street culture iconic clothing. And what we did is, the original space had this kind of drop ceiling. It was just a kind of shoe box. And we sort of kept the front half, but just covered it in metal and sort of sculpted the walls a little bit and used the metal as the display wall. So it's just a sheet of steel on the ceiling and the walls. The sneakers are simply hung on the wall with a magnet, so you have a lot of flexibility in terms of the quantity of stuff that you're displaying, and it's very easy to change out. You only have one sneaker at a time. You don't have like a stock, so everything's out. And on the ceiling, we use the same strategy for the hats, so they're just hanging like a field of color over your head. Super simple fixtures. And then as you move to the back, the thing that separates the front from the back is this change in the ceiling height and section, and also the cash wrap. The cash wrap is treated very simply as this cantilevered kind of rubber form where you go and pay for stuff. And then the back is we exposed a full double height space and just used metal pipe as the display system. So again, it's flexible. It feels almost like a playground or something that's just been colonized with clothing, and even the bench is just a piece of pipe.
This is a project we were commissioned by the City of New York to redesign a homeless shelter. It's a homeless shelter for families, and it was part of the New York City Design Excellence Program, where they select firms based on their design portfolio and not necessarily their past experience, which is it's extremely interesting to participate in. We feel it's an honor to have this chance to participate in the public realm of our city. The challenge here, this was entirely about the street. I mean, the site, it was a whole city block. It's 200 units, it's family units, and the whole building requires renovation. So the interesting challenge here was that this was one of the biggest canvases that we've ever had to work with, in contrast to the teeny floor thing or the doghouse. But then, because it's this gigantic canvas and it's a public project, the amount of detail that you can go into is so obviously constrained. Everything has to be completely indestructible, absolutely safe, perfect for safety cameras and night lights. And so what we really sought to do was to work as much as we could with the street and create this more interesting relationship. The building is an existing building structure, and we had the opportunity to reclad it and renovate the interiors of the units. So it has this kind of jogging, staggered characteristic, and we sought to work with that and on a very large scale kind of break the building blocks up with the use of color in the cladding, and then kind of bring it down a level, as you can see the different, the windows are tied together to create a secondary rhythm again on the street. And the whole thing will be reclad in metal wrapped insulated panels. As I said, the moves that we had were fairly limited, but the opportunity is enormous. So in a way, it's very close to our heart, even though sort of it looks very simple from the outside. And we couldn't find an existing picture, but it's actually it's all taupe now. So if you can imagine that, and it has a very different configuration. So this will be a lot better. It's supposed to come back online at the end of the year, which is really exciting. Here's the view from the other side. On the interior, we again used color, manipulating the door rhythm, and then really lightened up the railings. We tried to make them as light as possible so that there was more visual connection between neighbors to really create more of a community feel. Now this next project is in... Oh, we did get a Design Excellence Award from Michael Bloomberg in recognition of the fact that the change from what is there to what will be proposed, what's proposed was enormous. This next project is entirely speculative, and we entered the Electrolux kitchen design competition last 2010. And the charge there is to, create the kitchen of the future, and we thought that it would be an interesting challenge to work on something absolutely so small and just purely future-looking. The requirement is to work with Electrolux appliances, which of course are the heart of the kitchen. And then the thing that was intriguing to us is that obviously the kitchen should really be all about food. And this relationship between, you know, food is processed in the kitchen and then consumed. And we thought this was, I mean, this is just absolutely the crux of the whole experience there. But it's really only half of the cycle if you think about it, because the food is created someplace else and brought in. And so we thought that it would be really interesting if you could have some of the creation part and bring the whole cycle into the kitchen. And so we proposed a kitchen which was kind of like grow and cook, sort of bringing the entire experience into the house. So with a combination of the off-the-shelf Electrolux appliances, which were required, and you know, agricultural pieces like grow drawers and sort of irrigation trenches that you can see below the sink here, we created a kitchen machine, kind of, where you could produce and consume in a fashionable setting, we felt, your meal, and it would round out the cycle in a way that we felt was healthy. The other thing we did was we had ideas for using the exhaust heat from the back of the refrigerator, for example, to warm the, you know, plants or herbs that might need a different kind of environment for what you could provide. And the gray water from the sink would irrigate the plants that you see in the foreground here. And we liked the sort of relationship with Déjeuner sur l'herbe. It was just fun. We did win second place, which was great, and we got a whole kitchen. Which was actually the reason that we entered on a personal note. We were buying an apartment at the same time, so it was all a very happy confluence of events. I can't make it go ahead.
It's just slow. I think you just have to wait.
Our kitchen doesn't look anything like that, though.
So, you know, as architects in New York, we end up doing a lot of interior renovations as well. And you're looking at lofts and apartments and just trying to figure out different ways of living in these spaces, sometimes under very constrained conditions. This was a very wealthy client who we had done some work for, and he hired us to build out his small apartment in Miami. It overlooked the water. It was a developer apartment. It was sort of like 2 bedrooms and a living room. Each room had a kind of window out onto the ocean, but it felt just really what you would expect from a developer project anywhere. And so what we wanted to do was really open up the apartment so that it emphasized the fact that you were on the water, that you have this amazing view of the ocean, and that you're right on the ocean. So we reconfigured the entire space so that all of the windows are visible from all of the rooms in the apartment. The way we did that is we took the bedroom, which was originally on the left side of the space, and kind of demolished that wall, but created a moving wall which could create the bedroom when you need it, but disappear when you didn't. You can kind of see that in the 3 photos. And then on the right side, we moved the entrance into the master bedroom also to the window, so that when you have it open, as in the first 2 pictures, you can see those windows as well. And so this is a view of the whole apartment in the open condition. And then when you need that bedroom, that unit is about 2,000-pound unit, and it's hung from the ceiling. You can see that little crank on the end of it. You just turn that, and it kind of glides along on the ceiling. When it opens up, there's a Murphy bed that's sitting on the wall, and it plops down. And then the space, the unit itself has sort of the dresser and a closet built into it. And it also has the door, which then closes against the existing bathroom volume. So they were able to get a bedroom for their mother-in-law when they needed it, but most of the time they don't really need it. Then on that other wall, what we did is, you know, I mentioned before we wanted to open up the entrance to the master bedroom so that it was at the window. And really to draw people through, we really treated that whole wall as a continuous ribbon from the entrance all the way out to the window. The opening at the bedroom really looks like a large, it just looks like the wall sort of extending into the room, but it can be closed off. Part of what we got to do in this project, which we don't always get to do, is design the furniture. So this is the bed that we designed and a table that we designed. And for both of these, we used Rhino to model it, and we had it custom fabricated. The table was made out of foam and fiberglass, so it's also referred to surfboard technology. Dan is a surfer. It's on the beach. It seemed kind of appropriate to do that. To sort of further accentuate this idea that the interior of the space is sort of continuous with the ocean, the floor, it has this kind of sandy blue resin, which is a continuous surface, and it's reflective. So when you're looking out from the back of the space, it almost looks like it's just water and extends out into the ocean, because it's high up enough that you don't actually see the beach. So you see the floor and then the ocean, and depending on the light, it can be really dramatic. This is that cantilevered desk, and this is the desk and the bed in the main bedroom. And you can see how effective the floor is in kind of capturing the light and bringing in this kind of liquid condition into the apartment. We're on the beachfront section of our lecture. So this is the Coney Island boardwalk. And we were brought in by the Economic Development Corporation of New York. The Coney Island Aquarium, or the New York Aquarium on Coney Island, is an existing aquarium. It is on the boardwalk, but there's no opening that would let you see the ocean or the boardwalk or the beach when you're inside the aquarium, which we thought was kind of a travesty. The existing interaction between the boardwalk and the aquarium is this, decorative concrete wall. We didn't want the new building to be a sort of object. We wanted it to be much more sponge-like so that it could sort of interact with the boardwalk, and we wanted the structure itself to be like a reef, so that you have different ecologies within the building and on either side, but they're sort of allowed to flow in between each other and have a dialogue while still maintaining different kind of conditions on the interior and exterior. So the initial diagram was to sort of place the building on the site and then blur the edges both on the aquarium side and on the boardwalk side, so that you had an interaction between those areas. We worked with an exhibit designer on this project, and the zoo and the exhibit designer had a very specific narrative. That the exhibit was a kind of linear sequence, and it was very scripted, and they came with this as their sort of objective. What we thought was very interesting was juxtaposing that against the boardwalk, which is a kind of completely unscripted space, which extends out into the beach and the ocean. And the other potential that we saw is that although this is about the exhibits and visiting the exhibits, and that has to be a sort of central element, we thought that the act of visiting the exhibits and the visitors themselves could also be sort of on display to the larger public. So our building sort of sat on the boardwalk, but had a sort of diaphanous skin that allowed you to look into the exhibit viewers. And it also played with this idea of artifice and nature. An observation that we had is that, when you're there, the ocean is sort of possibly the most natural condition that we have on the planet. Then you go to the beach, which is actually a restored beach. It wasn't originally a beach. Then you go to the boardwalk, which is clearly a man-made kind of intervention. And then you have the exhibit, which replicates that other supernatural condition, but in the highly artificial way. It's this kind of little ecosystem floating in this man-made box sustained by machinery. So in order to kind of emphasize that kind of natural condition, we treated the boardwalk as a kind of landscape that went from dune to boardwalk to kind of artificial dune onto the building, creating a kind of space and a topography that you could occupy. It also, part of the charge from the Economic Development Corporation is that this building become an iconic element as the end of the boardwalk, with the parachute jump on the other end. So the idea is that the boardwalk sort of ends down here, and people would come down here, sit on the boardwalk, watch performers ideally, people traveling down, and then head back up toward the other side. In delirious New York, Rem Koolhaas speculated that the Coney Island amusement parks were sort of speculations on the city, kind of fantasy versions of New York City, or the potentiality of the city. And we thought that our little piece of, our little intervention could be sort of a fantasy beach in a way, as a kind of counterpoint to that. So the viewed aerially, it's sort of a disruption or a sort of melting of the boardwalk condition on both sides. And what it does is, in section, the aquarium is down below the boardwalk, but it creates the possibility of bringing people up so they can look into the aquarium. And also, because we imagined that the steps would be sort of open in some areas, you could also look through the platform out into the boardwalk. We also had some exhibits which would come down to the boardwalk. So that oval opening that you see there is actually a sea lion exhibit, which is on the roof of the building on the right, and they would have a diving tank so that you could see from the boardwalk the animals diving down into the space. You could also, the cafe for the aquarium was also located on the right side, and you could have this interaction between the boardwalk and the cafe. We also kind of proposed that maybe they could even service the boardwalk, and we got a little pushback from the aquarium on that, but we thought that that kind of interaction would be appropriate. And you can see in the skin, what we tried to do is we used a sort of mesh, and the idea was that it had this kind of volumetric sculptural quality to it, but it also allows you to see the activity behind it, and because it was a double screen mesh, you would get a kind of moire effect, and it would almost be like schooling fish or something that you might, that might be animated in a kind of passive, natural way. The top of the main shark building also allows you to view all the way down the boardwalk. On the aquarium side, we really treated it as a landscape element. The interior of the aquarium has very little green space. It's all like black pavement, literally asphalt. And so what we wanted to do is take advantage of the fact that we had this big roof area to create a little bit of a green space on that side, framed by that very scripted path sequence in. And at night, and this was part of the charge for the project, was that this thing had to be illuminated to become a beacon at the other end of the boardwalk, in the same way that they've spent a lot of money illuminating the parachute jump at the other end. This project has gone through several iterations and is now kind of dead. Another version of this with the original, we were brought in to propose a new design to replace a design that had been done before. Now the city funding has kind of dried up, so they're going back to the original proposal, more or less. Actually, they've incorporated a lot of our features into it. You're talking about this one, right?
Yeah. So this is another design excellence project, and we were brought in here to, this is the before picture. We were brought in here to renovate what they called, when we were doing the proposal, they called it the school library. And so we were very excited, and we won the commission. It was the library and the bathrooms of the school, but then when we got there, the library was basically the electrical closet. There it is. And so we felt that there was so much more that we could do, and this sort of fortuitous environment that this closet was in is that it's surrounded on all four sides by corridor. And so we immediately asked the school headmistress if it would be possible to grab the corridor, and then we set our sights a little higher and actually asked about the staff room. And the teachers and the headmistress were delighted. They wanted to do anything they could. And so instead of giving them a library, we created like a library hub. And we incorporated the entire area into being a reading, gathering space surrounded by books, but the students are passing through there to get to all their other functions. It was very, very simple, massive use of plywood here, a little bit of raked seating. The other challenge for the space is that it is entirely underground, and we wanted to do something to enliven it. So we put a mirror on the back wall and put a cloud mural on the sides and a reflective new matte ceiling across the top. So the sort of visuals that you get are much better than you might. And so this is the final product, and it actually came in way under budget. They were really delighted, and because we'd given them so much more, the school changed their programming, and they were able to have a little singing group, and they had speakers. It was just, it felt great. It was a tiny, tiny moment, but, and you can see there the seating area, which was not even on their radar before. This is before it was entirely filled, but it was really, it's a good project.
So those, I mean, both of those projects, you see how we're always trying to meet the program requirements, but we also, if the opportunity arises, want to give more. Obviously, that's what we're brought in. I mean, anyone could fill in the library, I guess. But these three projects sort of show how we have taken the program and then created either a public space or at least a community space where potentially there was none. And it's sort of a byproduct of the main design, but it ends up sort of defining the project. This was a project that we did a while ago. This was in collaboration with Min Cho and Moon Choi in Korea. And it was a new building on the corner of Haiti Art Valley, which is a new development just north of Seoul. And we had this corner lot. It was about 5 meters down from the corner. And part of the development was this idea that the master plan was kind of organized around these 5 hills, which you can kind of see on the plan on the left. And basically the plan sort of followed the topography of the landscape and kept these 5 hills as sort of green spaces within the development. This is tied a little bit to the city of Seoul, which also is kind of defined by these green hills. And we thought it was a strong and really compelling way of starting the project. So our site was on the corner, as I said, and our client came with us with the program of a theme park store for his Doggy products, which are these products that are sort of centered on this cartoon character, Doggy, which means strawberry, and she's this imaginary character who lives in a fruit patch, and it's sort of like Hello Kitty. It doesn't really exist as a narrative anywhere. It's just made to sell product, made to sell shoes, leather goods, very much like Hello Kitty. So we started to wonder how you kind of create something like this, which is imaginary, completely different scale, childish, in a way that's compelling architecturally and that can be, provide more than just this kind of like theme park condition. So we were given very specific program. There's souvenir store, cafe, bookshop, and then the client came in saying he wanted to create these sort of immersive environments, like I don't know, a planetarium room or a science room that needed to be sort of controlled. And so we kind of broke the program up into things that could be sort of field conditions and things that had to be objects. And we looked at 2 strategies. One was to centralize all the objects, and one was to scatter the objects throughout the field. We chose the latter. The other thing that we wanted was we wanted the space to be something where you could choose your own sequence of spaces. And the Korean bapsang meal, everything comes out and you kind of pick your courses. They're not delivered sequentially like a European dinner. And we wanted the store to function that way, both internally and on the exterior. We also looked at the issue of scale. As I said, Doggy is supposed to be a tiny strawberry person. And so we looked at, the way different artists have looked at scale and the significance of scale in relation to, physical space that you occupy. Very simple diagram for our building. Because the site was 5 meters down, we decided that we'd float the building at street level, basically 5 meters above the site, and then that creates sort of 3 different conditions: the roofscape, the interior of the building, and then the artificial kind of landscape underneath the building. The building is covered in grass. It's basically like a park structure. And then the space underneath becomes this, where that's a kind of natural landscape on top, literally planted and green. The space underneath becomes this kind of artificial playground landscape. The building sort of occupies the space between them, but can be entered in many different ways so that you have this kind of continuous circulation possible between interior and exterior, between rooftop and the underside. When you're on the roof, it's very easy to forget that you're on a building. And sadly, because this development was very successful, they ended up tearing that big piece of dirt that you see just beyond our building was one of the hills that they had now leveled to create a mall. So our building became sort of the remaining 5th hill that had kind of disappeared. The objects that I described earlier were used strategically between the different zones to create sort of, I referred to them as like hyperlinks between the roof, the interior, and the space beneath. So you could enter these and then sort of short circuit the longer meandering path that existed on the exterior of the building. Inside, we wanted to create a series of different spaces, but we wanted to use strategies of landscape. So rather than creating walls and things, we really extended the idea of a topography which might facilitate different uses without being very specific. This is one of these elements that connects down to the basement, which became an exhibit space and then leads down to the kind of artificial environment on the ground. The ground here is covered in rubber, and the ceiling has a series of lighting, water, and mirrored elements.
This next project was a project we were brought in to design a flagship store for Barbie. We were selected by Ogilvy and Mather and Mattel for this project. It was their first ever flagship store, and it was to coincide with the 50th anniversary of Barbie, as well as a huge kind of lifestyle campaign that they were embarking on. And there were makeup products, and this was actually a fashion show that they did at Bryant Park that same year. And we thought that in the most positive reading of Barbie, that she's this kind of escapist tool for little girls. You can kind of be the doll or control the doll, and in this act of controlling, that's something very unusual that children often never get to experience. And there's this aspirational aspect to the doll. She was the first astronaut. But you can't ignore there's other elements to Barbie, and however you feel about this product, it's certainly a cultural lightning rod, and something that has to be thought about in a sort of round, fully focused way. One of the things as we embrace this challenge of bringing an 11.5-inch doll into a flagship store in an architecturally compelling fashion was that the element of scale was a very relevant and important tool, because scale is really at the heart of playing with Barbies. Scale is at the heart of the delight in the Barbie house, and scale is certainly an architectural concern that we're all dealing with every time we approach a new space. The other thing that we thought was kind of funny was the sort of use of two-dimensionality versus three-dimensionality that they use very often with the Mattel toys. If you've ever played with like the old airplane or the camper, it's usually they're creating a whole scene with a sticker on the back, and that's what makes it a house or a plane or a camper. And we thought that would be a playful way to make some authentic links between the architectural project and the playful nature that required. And then another audience that needed to be absolutely catered to was the intensely involved collecting audience, and that was something that is a very active part of the Barbie community experience. This was the site in its first incarnation. It was the first movie house in Shanghai. That's not how it looked when we got there. But the sort of internal spaces were pretty much intact, so you had really weird floor-to-floor heights and raked areas, and it required very careful consideration of how the spaces would flow from one to the next. So as part of this project, Mattel was very interested in rooting Barbie in her historical roots, which for them were in a link with fashion. I mean, many fashion designers get their start designing for Barbie. And they wanted to make the link with sort of European fashion houses kind of all the stronger and sort of suggest this. And when we heard about their brief, one of the first ideas we had was that we were not going to recreate, in a kind of pastiche fashion, some sort of like French fashion house in Shanghai, but we thought that it might be interesting and playful to do something with maybe a facade that had a dual nature with an interior face and an exterior face, whereby the exterior face was, straight, kind of sleek, modern, which is also very preferential for durability and wear and a pollution in an environment that has pollution. And then the interior could be this kind of relief, and we thought cast glass might be interesting. We also thought maybe this use of two-sided facade, we could bring the idea of mass production into it, because obviously every Barbie doll is mass produced and they come out encased in plastic and several layers of plastic. So our first kind of concept model, which we showed them, was this. It's a two-layered facade, and the interior is literally the Barbie packaging with the exterior being a proposed storefront. It was a little too much, so we had to push it in a more architectural sense, because they thought they'd be kind of freaky if you're walking by seeing giant legs formed out of the molded polycarbonate, but it could have been cool. But the direction that we moved in was to use the two-layered polycarbonate storefront system, but make it a more architectural expression. And we also tried to make those interior spaces, the interior relief pattern, a little bit ambiguous, so that at one scale it could look like lockets or picture frames, and at another it could look like, an Art Nouveau window. We were collaborating with Ogilvy and Mather on the development of this frit pattern, which goes on the exterior facade. And it, from a distance, it recalls kind of climbing vines. And then when you look close up, you can see that the entire frit is made up of all these little brand pieces. They're icons. They have clouds and stilettos and purses and such. This was a model that we did early on, and it really very effectively shows how the light, by using the polycarbonate on the inside and the storefront on the exterior, the light that comes in is very diffuse, which is very attractive. It's great because the interior has a softer feel, and you still see the activity or experience the activity of the street. Because the project was in China, we had so many opportunities to do custom pieces that were very unusual. It was a very satisfying design experience that we were able to really take the design all the way from the top level down to the most custom little pieces and touch points, including the dishes at the restaurant, for example. So this is a picture of the facade completed as kind of a detail shot of 4 stories, and then here we can see it from across the street in the day. The facade had to act, the store had to be its own beacon, so it has a programmed color changing LED display which can be programmed to be any color, but it's almost always pink. I've never seen anything else. The other really nice effect, or sort of like byproduct of it, is that the light spills out onto the street, and the street is not actually wide enough to get a good view from far away, so the light spilling on the street creates its own advertisement. You can kind of see here, it's Waihai Road. We proposed pushing the entrance back to create a kind of a gathering area in the front where if they were getting crowds or wanted to create some kind of intrigue, they could kind of create crowds by holding people out there until they were coming in, and it also allowed for this interesting curvaceous expression here on the facade with the tiny windows for the, here already you can see the tiny windows for the doll and the woman-sized windows for the women's clothing. In a sort of late wrinkle to the project, Mattel was only to get the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th floors, and so we had to design a way to come in and get people up to the 3rd floor. So we came up with the idea of making the lobby being a sort of neutral, kind of like abrupt break with the street. I mean, the street is frenetic. It's in the middle of the shopping district, and so we absolutely precluded the use of any pink in the lobby except for kind of touch points. And we also smoothed out the lobby entirely to make it very different from the kind of orthogonal geometries you're seeing on the street. But then at the side of the lobby, there's this intensely glowing pink tube, which is the escalator taking you up. And that was very intentional. We thought it was an appropriate way to enter the Barbie store. So you come into the white lobby and then see the pink and understand that immediately that's the symbol of the Barbie store, and you go up. And then the first element that you really see right in front is a giant staircase. It has about 800 dolls. 800 is a really good number, and we were encouraged to get 800 dolls into the stair because that's another. It was a very sort of Chinese interest to have, like, the numbers had meanings attached to them, and so we made our target. One of the first ideas we had when we were brought in very early into the project was that while Mattel was expanding their footprint, they needed to keep their core, which is obviously the doll. So by using the doll as the central element and then overlapping the circulation with this display of this overwhelming number of dolls, it was obviously essential both sort of conceptually and physically. And this is the view as you come into the main space. It was very important to us that we create the different environments for the different types of products, but keep the space as open as possible. So we had the challenge of creating distinct areas that are also open. This is a view from, the reason that this was a challenge is because the product lines were so disparate. This was their highest end product, and it's actually literally couture pieces that were made in Japan, and they're all extremely expensive. So you can imagine the requirements that they had for these pieces was very different from what they had for the little plastic shoes upstairs. We had the opportunity to do all of the fixtures and custom rugs, even custom tile patterns. It was an amazing sort of experience to be able to have this total design kind of authorship. It wasn't, I was about to say control, but it is very difficult to control because what happens is it is all getting built in China. So there are real challenges there, but we certainly had the opportunity to design everything and then, as much as we could, control the sort of manifestation of it. This is the makeup area, and then one of the elements that I hadn't mentioned before, but there is this kind of persistent, sinewy curvature to the project, which is very important. Barbie is not orthogonal, as Mattel kept telling us over and over. She's not orthogonal, and she's playful. So that was really what the whole design grew out of, and I think that you would struggle to find a right angle in this project. This is the women's fashion area. we had this idea that different parts of the store could kind of recall house or residential elements, but souped up. This is supposed to look like a garden, and if you stand on the mezzanine, it looks like giant petal fixtures and sort of flowers, which when viewed from the right angle give that, you can sort of see it here, give that view. The third floor was women's, the fourth floor was dolls. We thought that the idea of scale, as we said before, was a really compelling mechanism for us. And we were able, by pushing the doll products to the fourth floor, to get these incredible views where the people would be the same size as the dolls. And this is one of those moments where she's obviously standing on the stairs, but she looks like a living Barbie. This is the toy area, and now here the experience level is much more tactile, really simplified. It's really for the younger child. Again, the pink is a coded signal that the playful side is on the one, and the white is really more about the circulation. We have a media library, which has some residential feel, but again, it's kind of amplified as fitting for a store environment catered around Barbie. This is a doll museum wall. Each of these dolls was custom made by a fashion designer. So to really highlight their specialness, we suspended them in they're held on small clips between 3 layers of scrim, and then there's lighting from above and below to kind of have this apparent floating feel. The fifth floor is really about girls' fashions, and so we thought that we would overscale the floor. So this is supposed to look like she's in a dressing room, but it's supposed to look sort of like a lampshade or a skirt or something. These are cash wraps, and they're obviously laminate reproductions of,
I should plug this in.
Anyway, they're two-dimensional prints of three-dimensional objects, and that's that whole idea of two-dimensional, three-dimensional. We made chairs for the cafe. Again, they're folded acrylic, and here we tried to show this kind of universal appeal of Barbie with a Western antique, an Asian antique, and a contemporary chair, all printed on the acrylic and folded. We thought this was kind of appropriate because it's this play on faux and real and mass production. These are dishes. These were the options that we came up with. This is the one that they chose. It was really an amazing opportunity to work so closely with the client and develop this sort of presentation of something that's obviously fundamental to the project. This is a restaurant. The tile pattern was a custom pattern from the first Barbie bathing suit. Don't know if anybody spotted that, but we could talk after. This is the exit, and it's like a zillion metal mirrors reflecting you, and you're remembering all the fun that you had as you leave.
So one thing that we should say about those photographs is Ewan, who just finished his show here, shot 99% of those images for us. He's fantastic. When Hayes was showing you the street elevation, he said it's a very narrow street. It looks like you've got the world. That's what Ewan can do. So this project is the last project, and it's another project for the DDC. It's a project for the Staten Island Zoo in Staten Island. It's located within an existing park that is sort of under the New York City Parks and Recreation Department. And our charge was, well, the existing zoo it's a very small zoo. It has sort of a formal zoo building in front, and then an informal children's zoo in the back. And it's really like a front yard, backyard kind of situation. The whole site is surrounded by a really beautiful, dense park of trees. So we wanted to keep those conditions. Now the main objective, a couple of objectives. One was to create a new children's zoo. The other was to create a new entrance on this side of the zoo, because the formal side of the zoo faces Broadway, but there's no parking on that side. Everybody comes to the zoo from this side, so they use this service door to go in. So we were charged with sort of creating the new public entrance, which will be sort of the main entrance. This is kind of an existing site plan. This is our plan for the children's area. So what we tried to do with the area is create two sort of circulation paths. First of all, we have this kind of entry building, which is right here. They needed a building for some educational programs and for the store, and so we used that as sort of the gate into the zoo. So you come through the fence there and then come between, sort of through the building into the main park. And once you get there, you have a sort of little plaza where school groups can gather, and you can follow the path down on the bottom of the screen, which takes you over to the main zoo, or you can go sort of into the children's zoo, which creates a sort of figure-8 looping circulation, which is perfect for small children because they can never go anywhere. One of the things that we noticed in the zoo is that the existing zoo has a tremendous amount of paved area, and we wanted to minimize that because it's not very efficient in terms of water management. And so a lot of the paved areas that we did propose were going to be sort of a much more of a cobblestone type paving, which was permeable and would allow certain areas to become unoccupied in the winter. When there's snow on it, you wouldn't clear this, but there also aren't that many people, so it has a built-in kind of flexibility between summer and winter. So this is the new permeability of the site, which is a significant improvement. All of this project, you know, we thought was appropriate that it be a very sustainable project because it is about nature, and so it's sort of the subject of the whole project, but it's also a requirement of the Design Excellence Program in New York City, which is a great thing. The other thing, as I mentioned before, is that all of these red zones indicate tree canopies. So we were supposed to build this thing in the middle of a kind of unbuildable site. So we had to come up with some strategies for building in a way that was not invasive and would preserve the trees. So the site, the main sort of entry building is here, as I mentioned before, and you come in and we created a sort of plaza here with some rake seating so that you could gather there, you could have a little performance, or just school groups could wait for everyone to sort of filter through. Then you could either take this path along the bottom. I sort of lost myself here. You could take this path to go to the main zoo, or come into the petting zoo here. And the petting zoo was sort of organized around this idea of a farmstead. The slight topography of the landscape also allowed us to create different sort of readings or perceptions of the space depending on which side you were approaching from. This is kind of an overall view. You can see the entrance building. And then another thing that we did is in the main zoo, like I said, we wanted to create this idea of a farmstead and integrate the landscape as part of the experience as you come in. But in order to do that, we also wanted to minimize the number of sheds. Currently, the zoo has like, I don't know, 25 little sheds for each animal. Like the bunnies have a shed, the horses have a shed. And what we wanted to do is consolidate them and organize each animal's area off of a different side of these barn structures. So we only have 3 barn structures down from like 20. And similar to the strategy that we used in Ordos, the buildings are sort of vernacular, it's sort of memories of vernacular architecture, but they're distorted so that from some angles they look like a long, very long, simple barn, or you know, more of a shed. Sometimes they look like a very compact structure. So it uses sort of perspective and the point of view to create very different sort of readings from each side of these things. And these are kind of also looked at in relation to the landscape and you know, whether you're looking down on the structure or up on the structure from the landscape. The next element is this kind of entry building that we created. And as I said, it was programmed to have an educational component, a small office, and a gift shop. Again, we treated it architecturally so that it read something like in between a landscape and a shed. So you could read it as sort of a hill or a rock outcropping, but you could also it could also look sort of like a barn structure. So it's a very simple structure in keeping with the kind of very informal farmstead sort of iconography of the children's farmstead. This is just a simple plan. It's a very small building. It is also suspended above the ground. Again, because we need to maintain the root structure of the trees, this and the other buildings that we're proposing for the site were all sort of built up on above the ground on pin foundations. So this is a view sort of entering the building. And then you can see the different barns and the next project, which is, this project is actually currently out to bid, and it's the leopard enclosure. It's a large exhibit for a leopard, which is currently housed in the main building, sort of inside. These poor leopards have been there for 10 years and have never seen daylight, which is just horrible. So these guys are going to get this amazing outdoor space. We're a little concerned that they're not going to know what to do when they have sunlight, but luckily they should be in there within a year and a half. It's a very simple structure. It's basically a net structure. We use piles rather than footings so that we could, again, minimize the impact on the trees. And some of the trees actually are part of the exhibit. Some of the living trees go through the enclosures, and they also provide shade in the summer, and then in the wintertime, obviously when the leaves come down, they allow the sun to come in. So we used the tree canopy sort of as an architectural element, as part of the architecture of this and other parts of the building. And then the last little piece we're going to show you is the carousel structure. This is a carousel that they want to bring to the zoo. We located it near the main building so that it sort of concentrated these buildings in one area, and also so there could be a sort of synergy between the cafe and the carousel. Kids could wait in line for the carousel while their parents got food or went into the main building. Again, it's located right between a series of trees, so it was very difficult to locate on the site. We have a ETFE roof, which is a kind of transparent membrane roof. It's a double-shelled roof. And the main space is very simply just like a glass enclosure around the carousel. Part of the reason we wanted to use the ETFE roof is to allow light into the carousel enclosure, because we visited many carousel enclosures around the city and elsewhere, and usually they have a solid roof and you can't really see the carousel from outside. So this should allow you to see the carousel very clearly without any artificial light. As you can see, the whole thing is mounted on these pin foundations, which are kind of interesting. They're like these concrete blocks, and then you drive steel pins through them, and the pins create enough of a surface area that it holds the structure up without having to dig or pour anything in the ground. Again, the roof works kind of symbiotically with the canopy of the trees, so that the transparent roof, in the summertime, the leaves block the sun and prevent it from heating up the carousel. In the wintertime, when there are no leaves, the sun can go in and provide kind of natural heating for the carousel, making it just a little bit warmer than the outside spaces. All of the windows, all of the enclosure on the vertical surfaces are these giant glass panels, which can be slid open. So in the summer, they would be open like this, and in the winter, they're sort of shut, again, capturing the heat from summer to winter. And they kind of stack on top of each other so that you kind of maximize the openness. Half the panels move, half are fixed. And then, the last kind of details are on the glass itself. We created this frit pattern of little animals so that kids don't run into the glass. And it goes from solid animals to kind of negative animals in this kind of continuous gradient. What's that?
Did you say that was the most contagious?
Oh yeah, that's Hayes reminding me that we spent 80% of the discussions with the zoo was about the pattern. Everything else was kind of really easy, but the animal, like, why do you have a mouse in there and not aardvark? It's like, okay. You never know what the hitch is going to be in some of these projects. All right, that's it. Thank you very much.